Welcome to tonight's webinar on Wildflower Meadows. What key species should we be focusing on? My name is Becky Williams and I'm a Wild Network Officer at Cheshire Wildlife Trust. And for those of you who aren't aware, the Wild Network is a community of people across our region who care about nature and are taking action or wanting to take meaningful action to help wildlife in their local area. So we offer training workshops, webinars, lots of different ways to get involved. You can find us on Facebook at Cheshire's Wild Network. And if you haven't already, you can sign up to our monthly mailing list through the Cheshire Wildlife Trust website. Also, before I introduce the speaker today, just a gentle reminder that all the contents in this presentation cannot be reproduced or used by anyone without express permission from both Josh and Cheshire Wildlife Trust. So please feel free to get in touch for more information. So I am really excited to introduce our wonderful speaker this evening. We are so grateful to have the fantastic ecologist Josh Stiles joining us for a deep dive into both common and rare beneficial species to include in wildflower meadows across the Cheshire and Wirral region. Josh is an award-winning botanist and ecologist known for his work on rare species conservation across the Northwest. He's the founder of the Northwest Rare Plant Initiative and British Botany, and he has an incredible understanding of native species and habitat restoration. It's definitely worth looking on Josh's website, British Botany, to see all of Josh's online courses and field workshops, which I will show you at the end of this presentation. So yeah, I can see on this call tonight, I can see so many wonderful representatives from different community groups who really care about meadows and know that I really know that they're all so interested to learn about what Josh has to say about where they should be focusing their efforts to have the maximum benefit to wildlife. So yeah, I will hand over to you, Josh, if you want to take control of the screen. Thank you very much.
Sure. I think I've taken control of it now. Becky, brilliant.
Yeah, you've got it.
Hello, everyone. And welcome to today's presentation, which focuses on everything Wildflower Meadow, because we've got a limited amount of time. So I'm going to try and fit a lot of information in a relatively short space of time. Do feel free to ask questions at the end. Of course, as the title of this presentation suggests, what we are going to be focusing on, or what we are going to be paying particular attention to, are the species that we can find within our fantastic wildflower meadows. So to start off, to begin, I think it'd perhaps just be worth going over a few learning objectives or things that I would like for people on this course to understand, or to understand a little bit more by the end of this presentation. Firstly, I really want everyone, if you don't already, to understand what a meadow is. I would like people to understand some of the floristic and geological differences that can be found between British meadows. So the differences in the flora and the geology that can be found between meadows, which is something we're going to be covering. We're also going to be covering some of the key species found across British meadows, and also some of the different approaches to recreating meadows, which is, I'm sure, one of the main reasons a lot of people have tuned in to this little 1 hour talk, with a particular emphasis on the different approaches to species reintroduction. So, to start from the very beginning, what is a meadow in the most basic sense? Well, in the broadest sense, we have a lot of different definitions for meadows in the scientific literature between different habitat classifications, but really, where there is consensus is that a meadow is a permanent and wildflower-rich grassland that is also nutrient poor and managed by mowing. And that's it. really. Very often, meadows are after mowing, followed by grazing after the cut, or otherwise called aftermath grazing. In terms of um, other stuff that is related to meadows, we also tend to find that meadows have a very high cover of broad-leaved herbs, so flowering plants that are not grasses. And within meadows, generally, we have a cover of broad-leaved herbs exceeding 30%. While if we consider species richness within a square meter, we've said that meadows are wildflower rich grasslands. Just how wildflower rich? Well, within a square meter, we can find an astronomical number of species, between 50 up to 40 species in a square meter. In the very broadest sense, that is a meadow. We've talked about, in the broadest sense, what a meadow is. I just fitted this slide in here because I think it's also worth talking about what a meadow isn't. And very often, commercial suppliers, supermarkets, garden centres often sell sort of colourful mixes of annuals with things like cornflowers, corn cockles, poppies, like in this top left picture here. And they often market that seed as wildflower seed, but in reality, all of these species are not native. Um, they require, unlike our proper wildflower meadows, they need annual herbicide application, rotivation, reseeding, and all of that decimates our delicate soil microbiota. So our soil microbiota, the complex life formed of all of the different animals and fungi, especially under the soil. And all of that soil microbiota is just absolutely decimated by the management approach that we need for these non-native displays. As well as all of that, these displays are not meadows. They are damaging to soil microbiota, but they also support above ground a fraction of the diversity that native wildflower meadows support. And just as an add-on, things like glyphosate that we need to manage them are associated with serious health, human health disorders, things like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and all kinds of other things. If we just compare between sort of some of our native wild plants versus non-native, why does it matter? If we have a meadow with non-native annuals or native perennials, well, actually, what we have with our native plants are species which have co-evolved with our native invertebrates. And so if we look at things like cocksfoot, a common native grass, we have around 140 insects which use cocksfoot as a food plant. Things like cow parsley, 39, things as common as dandelion, over 100, bird's foot trefoil, 132. If we compare that with non-natives, very few species are actually able to use these plants. Okay, so we know in the broadest sense what a meadow is. But meadows aren't all the same. They are very different depending on the environmental context, which can change how a meadow looks, which can change the kinds of species assemblages that you'll be able to find within them. Um, if we think of the kind of soil pH that we find meadows on, the soil pH is consistently around about neutral, pH neutral, 5 or 6. But actually, some meadows are found on sandy loams, which can be sort of acid to neutral at the more slightly acid side of that neutral scale, if you like. Some meadows can be found on sort of clays that might be rich in lime. So they could be a bit more alkaline or calcareous to neutral. And so actually, although meadows are often described as a kind of neutral grassland, they're perhaps more accurately described as circumneutral grasslands, grasslands that form on soils with a pH around about neutral. Okay, brilliant. So meadows are not all the same. Um, Environmental context, including things like soil pH, can impact the kind of assemblage of plants that we might expect to see in a meadow. Alongside differences in things like soil pH, which can influence the kind of species that we can find, some meadows are associated with floodplains, and some of them aren't. And actually, if we think about floodplain meadows, they're typically a little bit wetter. They're often inundated with water over winter. And because they're on a floodplain and they're flooded and have alluvium and other things go over them, they're naturally more nutrient rich, as well as perhaps being a little bit wetter. So we'll have generally on floodplains taller swards with things like meadowsweet and great burnet versus non-floodplain grasslands. Okay, so we know what a meadow is. It's permanent, wildflower-rich grassland. But meadows can be quite variable depending on the context. They're not all the same. Okay, so those are a few points that we've covered. As well as that, we hopefully most people on this call will realize that meadows actually are super, super important. We have lost a hell of a lot of them over the past just shy of a century, following the introduction of artificial fertilizers, specifically fertilizers where phosphates are feature quite heavily. Phosphates are a persistent nutrient, so they are something you might describe as a forever chemical. They stay in the soil forever unless we do things to actively remove them. And we'll be talking a bit more about that in a bit. So following the introduction of artificial fertilizers, we have lost a lot of those meadows because when we add fertilizers, especially phosphates, a lot of people think that fertilizers are great for plants, but actually they decimate natural ecosystems because they essentially favor competitive species over our more diminutive wild plants. So we get a few species outcompete everything else. Okay, so we've got not a great deal left. In terms of our non-floodplain meadows, we've got less than 10,000, around about, or less than 10,000 hectares left for Britain. For floodplain meadows, they're even rarer. We've got less than 3,000 hectares left. And that might sound a lot, but if we put that into perspective, we have about 24 million hectares in terms of our land surface area in Britain. So 3,000 hectares, it's less than 0.001 of a percent. Really not a great deal left at all. They are hugely valuable for a superb range of flora, fungi, and fauna, from things like grass and fungi, like this pink wax cap to the bottom right. Things like wax caps are associated with old grasslands. They can take sort of onwards of 100 years from spore to mushroom or fruit body like this. Super important for a range of different fungi. Super important for a range of different invertebrates, especially including orthopterans, so your grasshoppers and crickets. A lot of ground nesting birds, things like skylarks, actually depend on things, especially like grasshoppers, to eat. So if we don't have grasslands rich in orthopterans, our grasshoppers and crickets, then we don't have grasshoppers rich in things like skylarks. Um, in terms of our plant diversity as well, meadows are absolutely enormously important. About a third of our native plant species are found in species-rich grasslands, species-rich meadows, which is more than any other habitat that we can find in Britain. Hugely important, but also now, sadly, very rare. And I've just got a little illustration of a kind of bird's eye view to demonstrate perhaps a visual difference of a couple of grasslands that you might not think twice at if you look at them. But actually up close, in terms of their species richness, they are very, very different. So on the left, we have a lowland meadow that is immensely species rich. If we look at this bird's eye view here, we've got birdsfoot trefoil, common bent, common knapweed. The list goes on. We've got 19 species in this little square meter here. What's happened in the picture on the right, though, is we've added a huge amount of artificial fertilizers, and as a consequence, we've got all of those, virtually all of those plants, outcompeted by a couple of highly competitive grasses. And this is the story for the majority of what we had as species-rich meadows once upon a time. Okay, so a quick summary before we move on. Meadows are permanent, nutrient-poor grasslands on soils with around about neutral pH, circumneutral. They support an exceptional diversity of wild plants, animals, and fungi, especially plants. But they're not all the same. They vary with their environmental context. They could be on a floodplain or not. They could have different soil pHs, and other things could be different, which could influence the kind of assemblage of species that could develop within any one given meadow. The sad news, though, is that true wildflower meadows are now exceptionally rare in Britain and Ireland. But it's not all bad news, because conservation bodies, individuals, lots of different groups, lots of different people, like Cheshire Wildlife Trust, to name one, is doing it. There are things that are being done to recreate. There are things that can be done to recreate wildflower meadows. And you can recreate a wildflower meadow whether you own a field, a huge field, whether you own a small, tiny garden. And so now I am going to highlight perhaps a few things as it relates to how you can recreate a wildflower rich meadow. And the first thing I'm going to be talking about is management. So the bad news is we have lost a lot of our wildflower rich meadows, and they are super valuable. So that is seriously bad news. The good news is that even though we've lost such a high proportion of them, there are ways to help reverse some of that damage that we've inflicted upon them. And one of the ways is how we can manage a grassland, whether it's a lawn or a big field. If we employed cut and collect management, so where you let a grassland grow over summer and cut it and collect or remove the clippings, that kind of management approach actively removes, it strips nutrients from the soil, which is a brilliant thing. And if we look at some of the literature reviews available on just how much of our kind of soil nutrients are stripped just by cut and collect management every year, it's about 5%, which is actually quite a lot. Um, One thing about cut and collect management as well is it can also mimic grazing. So when you're cutting and removing the clippings, you're creating openings and stimulating increases in wildflowers as seedlings are able to germinate because more light reaches the soil. Um, Because within grasslands, within meadows, um, plants flower at different times. Insects, different species operate at different times. And so, if anyone has ever looked at advice on when to perhaps cut their meadow, when to cut their lawn meadow, their field, um, what you might have found is the advice is actually quite variable. But being realistic and being perhaps holistic, thinking holistically about invertebrates, fungi, and the full diversity of wildflowers that we can find within meadows, actually timing a your cutting between the end of August and the start of March, essentially allows later flowering species to survive. It allows a much larger proportion of our insects to go through and complete their life cycles. And it ultimately promotes a higher diversity of wildflowers compared with earlier cuts. Say if you cut in July, in the middle of summer. Brilliant. So we can use management as a way to help recreate a meadow, a wildflower rich grassland. Of course, another thing we can do is incorporate species into our lawn, into our fields, into our grasslands to ultimately increase species richness, the richness of species that we can find there. But one thing that we did say earlier, one thing that we do know is that all meadows aren't necessarily the same. They can vary depending on their environmental context. But the good news is, although meadows can be seriously varied depending on that environmental context, a number of species can be found consistently throughout most of them. So there's the good news. If we think about the grasses that we will commonly find within these meadows, things like red fescue, a really beautiful narrow-leaved short grass, things like Yorkshire fog, crested dog's tail, sweet vernal grass, a nice smelly early flowering and golden browny grass, common bent, one of the later flowering grasses. These are species that are fairly ubiquitous. They're commonly found throughout a lot of our meadows. If we think about the non-grasses, things like red clover, ribwort plantain, meadow vetchling, common knapweed, this purple flower here, and bird's foot trefoil, an immensely valuable, one of the most important broad-leaved herbs within a meadow. If people remember back to the table, it's got 132 insects which use it just as a food plant. Never mind all of the array of moths, beetles, bees especially, which use it as a nectar resource. So we've got all of these things that are fairly commonly found throughout most of our meadows as well. If you've got a field that is perhaps you've done some soil testing or you've got a pH meter, or if you've not done that, you might think, ooh, I've got some acid grassland indicators. I might have a bit of tormentil or a bit of pignut in one corner. If you have a site where you've got slightly acid to neutral soils, so with a pH generally between 4.5 and 5.5, these kinds of meadows very frequently have a high abundance of these plants, things like devil's bit scabious, tormentil, pignut, and Botany, a nice late flowering plant. Um, by contrast, on sites that perhaps don't have that kind of acid to neutral pH, they're more in the middle, around pH 5.56. You tend to find that things like oxeye daisy on the left and field scabious on the right tend to feature more prominently. And conversely, again, on calcareous or alkaline to neutral soils with a pH sort of over 6, these kinds of meadows tend to have more calcareous indicators, things like lady's bedstraw, yellow oak grass, a really beautiful yellowy golden grass, flowers in the summer, salad burnet as well. If people are interested in eating plants, a lot of these are edible as well. Things like salad burnet tastes like cucumber. It's really nice. Yeah, brilliant. So, although our meadows are variable, there are species that actually we can fairly consistently find within meadows, and these are species that might be suitable to perhaps introduce to help recreate a meadow. Um, in addition to all of those things, we can also use this plant, yellow rattle, as a tool to help recreate meadows, turning our grass-rich grassland back into a wildflower-rich grassland. And yellow rattle does that because it has a really fascinating adaptation. And I really love yellow rattle because people often think of plants as these boring, still objects within the landscape. But in all reality, they're really vicious things. And yellow rattle, just like every other plant within a grassland, has come up with adaptations that give it a competitive edge. And this particular adaptation is, I think, quite interesting. Because when yellow rattle, the seed germinates, it's an annual. When it germinates in the spring, around early March, um, when the roots from the seed bury into the ground and they come across the root, generally of a grass, the root of yellow rattle attaches itself and pierces the root of the grass and essentially sucks out nutrients for itself. It's a bit of a vampire. And so, actually, this semi-parasitic plant, yellow rattle, we can use it within meadows to help us transition species poor and grass-rich grasslands back into species-rich, wildflower-rich grasslands, because it diminishes the vigor and abundance of grasses through parasitizing them. Brilliant. And lastly, when it comes to species to perhaps think about, to incorporate within meadows, if you want to recreate them, are the rarer species. Now, one thing to bear in mind about some of our grasslands and also a lot of our other habitats as well is that they are associated with species that can have seeds that are not viable for very long. They can be associated with plants that can't disperse very easily or very far. They can have plants that take a long time to get from seed to flowering plant. And these plants that ultimately struggle to colonize or recolonize new areas um, can really often be restricted to ancient meadows. Things like Dyer's greenweed. Um, I'm based in Liverpool in the northwest, and Dyer's greenweed is functionally extinct across most of northwest England, despite being historically described in some places as a weed of pastures and meadows. And unfortunately, Dyer's greenweed has been lost because, much like us, I would hope, it doesn't like inbreeding. It needs large populations with high genetic diversity to produce viable seed. And so, what we've done by destroying its habitat, fragmenting its habitat, is make these populations shrink so that they're too small to essentially be able to sexually reproduce. Um, and so perhaps when it comes to recreating meadows, some of these rarer species, particularly things like Dyer's greenweed, that were once described in many parts of England as very frequent, very abundant, it may just be worth considering whether any of these things exist locally to you. And if anyone's interested in finding out a bit more, perhaps about the ancient meadow, ancient grassland indicators that can be found in meadows, I've put a little reference at the bottom of this slide. So it's Natural England 2013 Technical Information Note, or TIN 147. Brilliant. Okay, so on the topic of recreating meadows, we can use management to help ameliorate, to help put right some of the conditions that we have uh, adjusted through whether it's importing topsoils or adding fertilizers. We can use management to help recreate meadows. We can incorporate species into our grasslands to help them transition back into wildflower-rich places. And we can even use some species like yellow rattle as a tool to help us along the way. But there are perhaps also some considerations for all of that. When it comes to recreating wildflower meadows to bear in mind. Firstly, when it comes to using commercially available mixes, what you will often find is that commercially available mixes that you'll buy online, um, they're often fraught with non-native species that aren't sort of advertised in the list. Um, Things like common birdfoot trefoil, red clover, salad burnet. Um, these are often sold as native plants, but actually they're agricultural cultivars in the mix. So not truly native species. They've been selectively bred for various purposes. And so really, if you want to get wildflower seed, one of the best ways really is to obtain it from local sites where the provenance of plants is guaranteed. We're not going to get any invasive or non-native species turn up in our mixes that we've just bought online or anything that we don't want. Um, and to get that local seed, we can use green hay. So if a meadow's just been cut, you can actually use the freshly cut hay and scatter it on your lawn, on your field, to introduce lots and lots of seed that's going to be rich in that hay as a means of introducing some of those species. Um, if we don't want to do that, um, there is something called a brush harvester, which is usually a little attachment to a little tractor. And a lot of people use brush harvesters. I know Cheshire Wildlife Trust use it on a lot of their meadows to harvest seed. And a lot of suppliers online do sell brush harvested seed obtained from local meadows. The nearest commercial supplier that sells that kind of seed near me is Cumbria Wildflowers, and I'm not 100% if Cheshire Wildlife Trust offer it, but to folks. But okay, Becky's shaking her head. Okay, brilliant. Um, so there's those few things to perhaps consider. And very lastly, recreating a meadow isn't like sowing some cabbage seeds and expecting a crop in the same year. Recreating meadows is something that really isn't instant. It happens over 2, 3, 4, 5 years plus, but it is well worth the wait. And so I just thought I'd just perhaps do the last few slides mainly looking at my own garden, which is, oh my God, it's the absolute love of my life. Um, but yes, it is also a grassland that I've been managing for a very long time, now for 5 years. And I just thought it'd be a nice little visual representation to end on. So, um, thinking about recreating meadows, staying on that thread, this is what I personally started out with in my little garden in October 2021. It was dominated by perennial ryegrass with bits of white clover and a lot of dog mess. And that is what I really started out with. But in between 2021 and the summer of 2022, I managed to harvest seed locally from development sites, also from nature reserves with permission. Um, I was able to rescue 7 marsh orchids from a development site. And in the summer of 2022, this is what I had. It was very, very grass rich, and you might just be able to make out one of the flowering spikes of those 7 marsh orchids just around my house in the sort of bottom left corner of this image. Still very grass rich, still very species poor. I also had a little bit of yellow rattle in there that was just starting. So that was year one. In year two, things changed a little bit. Where we couldn't see those marsh orchids through the dense thicket of grass, we can start to see them now. In this picture, there's one sort of in the top here, and there's one in the middle, just starting to flower. And all these pictures are taken, I should say, at the same time of year. We can see that yellow rattle has come in a little bit more. We've also got other wild plants that we can just about make out here. We've got this branching stem, which is from common catsia. We've got these little flowering spikes. This is ribwort plantain. We've got this plant in the bottom right, common knapweed, got a bit of red clover as well. So we've got a few things turning up in year two, but still very grass rich. Year three is really when things started to very, very quickly, visibly change. Yellow rattle is becoming more abundant. Where we had sort of almost chest height grass to start out with in the first year, the grass is actually much less vigorous, much less abundant, and much shorter as well. It's about half the height that it was in the first year. We can see very clearly our marsh orchids through this sward here. We've got meadow buttercups, which I had maybe one or two in the first and second years, and I think I went up to 30 or so in this year. There's a lot. There's a lot more yellow rattle, lesser trefoil, red clover, all of these wildflowers, which we can see a little bit more clearly in this picture here. This was 2024. And then last year, very finally, things changed in a very, very big way for me. The yellow rattle became hyper abundant and really took the grass down to calf height. So it's like a third or a quarter of the height that it was in the first year at the same time around late May, early June. From those seven original marsh orchids, a very rare species for me in Liverpool, sadly. I had over 30 that were in flower and tens more that weren't in flower. I'm hoping for sort of 60 or 70 next year, fingers crossed. So we've got a lot of marsh orchids, which we can see these purple flower spikes through this sward. We've got a lot of yellow rattle. We've got a lot of wildflowers, common knapweed, red clover, all of those things that we talked about in terms of species selection, they have all became really, really super abundant now. Um, and this isn't the end. Next year, things will become even more colourful, hopefully more species rich. Um, and also, this series of pictures is just my back garden. My front garden is also super, super species rich. And this is a picture of it in the bottom right. The abundance of invertebrates has also been amazing. From that grass-rich, dog poo-filled mess, I've got things like a big colony of common blues, butterflies that have set up, a huge number of pollinators from the beetles, like this thick-legged, thick-thighed flower beetle to the bees, huge number of solitary bees, bumblebees. And of course, one thing that a picture can't really do is show you how something sounds. Um, the diversity and abundance of grasshoppers here is, oh, I love it. It is a really seriously audible chirp in summer from meadow, common field, and green grasshoppers which have just absolutely kicked off in my garden. And just so people can see it kind of from an aerial view, we started out from with something that was really dominated by grasses. And this is what we have now, a space that is actually immensely wildflower rich. Brilliant. Um, And I didn't want to stop there really either, because when we talk about recreating wildflower grasslands, um, recreating meadows for yourself, whether it's in your lawn, a field, is amazing. But really, no matter what we do, it doesn't change the fact that these are still very rare habitats, unfortunately. And so actually, one thing that we can do on top of recreating meadows is use meadows in a very positive, meaningfully positive way. So, in the past 4 years, when I cut my lawns after summer, I don't just compost the hay or give it to someone with horses. I have given it to over 10 people. Where I've managed to establish yellow rattle in all of their gardens, alongside a huge number of other wildflowers that have ultimately come from my own lawn meadows. As well as that, um, Netherley, the place where I am, there's two known sites for southern marsh orchid, and there's less than 60 marsh orchids in my whole town. My garden probably has more than that. So every year when my marsh orchids set seed, I actually use the seed and in other meadows that I manage for I manage about 2 hectares of grassland for Liverpool, which Liverpool Council owns. So I use the seed from my gardens to incorporate there. Um, so we can use not only do so much stuff to re-establish an amazing valuable habitat for so many species, but we can also help other people do it, which is amazing. um, we could do that by giving away green hay. If we have a particularly important species like southern marsh orchid, we could put the seed in sort of strategic places to help those rare species populations recover. And even with rare species like Dyer's greenweed, a very rare, functionally extinct species through much of northwest England, um, I've been taking over 300 cuttings, hardwood cuttings a year from the plants I have in my gardens, my tiny, tiny little gardens. I've managed to establish 50 plants from summer cuttings, so hardwood cuttings taken in winter. I took 50 summer cuttings and established 50 plug plants. Um, I managed to establish a big population at Cutacre Nature Reserve in Wigan last year. So we can do so much stuff to help our really rare meadows, all of the wildlife that is encompassed within them, from common and widespread species to things like yellow rattle to rarer species, things like our marsh orchids, or even really rare species like Dyer's greenweed. Um, yeah, yeah, brilliant. I hope that was a really interesting presentation, or there might have been interesting little bits for people. I know it was a lot to pack in, so I'm sorry if it wasn't as detailed as some people might hope. But yeah, yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was incredibly interesting, and I am still so jealous that you have orchids growing in your back garden. That is amazing. It's also amazing to see the statistics of the sort of native compared to non-native and how many insects and wildlife they support in comparison. It's amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to try and rattle through as many questions as I can, if
Okay,
that's okay, Josh.
cool.
So we've had a couple of questions which are quite similar, so I'll try and roll them into one. Georgia asked, did you have to do pH testing on your lawn before creating it or importing any different soil? And someone else has asked, did you do anything to strip the nutrients from the soil?
Ooh, yeah, interesting one. So, funnily enough, I have actually been doing soil testing 2 times a year for my lawn. I didn't have to, necessarily. I just wanted to for my own interest. Um, and yeah, it's been a really interesting journey, not just to see visibly the wildflower species richness increase over time, but that has been correlated very clearly with the soil nutrient status decreasing over
Mm,
time. So yeah, I have been doing soil testing, which looked at pH as well as soil nutrients. But you don't necessarily have to do that, particularly anyway for like a lawn or um, that kind of
mm.
space. It might just be interesting too.
Amazing. Thank you so much for explaining that. That's brilliant. I've got a question that was sent in before the webinar, actually, and I think it's a really good one. Lynn from the group Happy Valley Bramall, who are restoring a wildflower meadow near Stockport that is very wet in the wintertime and very dry in the summer. And she's interested to hear about any plants that can withstand both wet and dry conditions. Do you have any suggestions?
Maybe. So if it is, for example, on a floodplain that floods over winter and is quite dry in the summer, perhaps species like meadowsweet, like great burnet, might be quite well adapted there. There is one floodplain meadow species, or a species that can be found in floodplain meadows, that Cheshire Wildlife Trust, I donated some seed and Cheshire Wildlife Trust are cultivating. It's
Mm,
almost extinct in Cheshire now, and that is sawwort as well. So,
okay.
and I do know the Wildlife Trust are giving away plug plants for
That's
that for
good.
meadows that are suitable. So, yeah.
Amazing. Maybe they need to get in touch with us then. That's great. Fantastic. We've got another question here. How do you persuade people who aren't interested in nature why it's important to boost biodiversity and reverse the soil damage that has been caused?
Oh yeah, oh God, I don't know. Lots of ways. Um, I mean, I'll give you one example. I was recently contacted by a person at Liverpool who worked for Liverpool Council, and he was trying to ask me for my advice when it came to a community group who wanted to plant fruits and vegetables in a park, and he thought that nature and grow fruits and veg are really two very separate things. Of course, nature,
Mm,
particularly our plants, these are organisms that are fundamental to all life on our planet. But just in that context, the facts of the matter are that wild spaces that are rich in biodiversity, rich in plants, including species-rich meadows, where they occur in close proximity to agricultural systems, productivity, the amount of food we get, goes up because we
mm,
have huge numbers of pollinators, crop pest predators, things like that. So wildlife and just as one example, food production can actually go hand in hand. And I
mm.
grow lots of fruit and veg alongside my wildflowers in my garden. But yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, it just goes to show, doesn't it? It's good for everything. Wonderful. A couple more questions. Would the wildflower meadow be considered dog friendly for someone maybe thinking about having one at home?
Oh yeah, I mean they're dog friendly, they're cat friendly. One thing to perhaps consider though is dog wee and cat wee and poo.
Mm,
They that does add nutrients.
mhm,
Um, and sort of yeah. So it may not if your dogs and your cats are going into your garden regularly all the time and weeing and pooing. If you don't clear it up
mm,
anyway that might not favour a more sort of wildflower rich meadow.
mm.
Um, but yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Someone said that they have difficulty getting yellow rattle to persist on acid neutral soil. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing about yellow rattle is the seed doesn't remain viable for very long. So you have to either harvest it fresh or get it from a supplier who has harvested within literally less than a year with like last if we're talking about now they need to have harvested from last year. Also it germinates in February and it needs lots of light, so if you've
Mm,
got tall grasses and other things um sort of late February early March, um then it's not going to do very well. So one thing I do, number one, harvest fresh seed, use fresh seed. And number two,
mm,
what I do in the early days of establishment is cut generally again around January, February time to help yellow rattle really kick off. So that's
mm.
maybe one thing you could do.
Amazing. I think I'm going to
Um,
pay. Oh, gone.
I I was just gonna say, there's quite a few questions, so I don't know if anyone wants to email me.
Mm.
I don't know if you want to give that to people, Becky, or if people are interested, my email is josh@britishbotany.co.uk. Um,
That's a
just thought
great
I'd
idea.
mention it
Yes,
before finishing.
absolutely. And if they can't, I'll definitely send that out in a follow-up email. And also just to say that if you go on Josh's website, British Botany, you've got a contact page on there as well, don't you? So that's great that you're happy for people to message you with questions. That's really kind. Thank you. I'm going to end on one more question. And while I do that, I'll just get the PowerPoint back up. What do your neighbours think of your garden?
Apart from one person who has anger issues, they love it. Yeah, yeah. I think they thought I was a bit crazy when I was bringing nettles and brambles to plant, but
Mhm.
yeah, no, they really, really love it now. I
Oh,
have
brilliant.
next to me a mum with a kid who just loves it, and all the grasshoppers that
Oh,
come into her garden. So
that's so great to hear. Oh, thank you so much, Josh. That was brilliant. I hope everyone found that as interesting as I did, and I will share as many links mentioned as possible in the next few days, and also pop this recording on our YouTube channel. Just really quickly before everyone leaves, if you are keen to learn more about native plants, definitely check out Josh's website, British Botany. He's got so many amazing online courses on there. And I think field courses as well. Is that during the summer, Josh, or is that every now and again?
yeah, yeah. To be honest, I do have a field courses section, but I rarely offer them. It's mostly online
No, fair
stuff.
enough.
But yeah.
Well, to be fair, there's so many amazing ones online, so that's brilliant. So yeah, I'd encourage everyone to go and continue their learning on here. Also, I just wanted to say a couple of reminders about how you can get more involved in helping nature through something called the Wild Network, which I mentioned at the start. So it's essentially a network of people from across Cheshire and Wirral who want to see wildlife recover and are actively involved in local conservation. On the left here, so we've recently got a new community map tool, which will hopefully help you to find local environmental projects that you can get involved in, including community-run meadows near where you live. We're also on Facebook at Cheshire's Wild Network. You're welcome to share any meadow updates. You're welcome to ask for advice or help on there, or even help with sort of volunteer-led projects. You're very welcome to post on there. And I also send a monthly newsletter, which is kind of the best way to find out about all our conservation workshops, all based on what the network tells me they're interested in. So yeah, there's a bit of, hopefully something for everyone on there. So if you haven't already, please do join the mailing list. And then finally, a quick plug to mention some of our other webinars this winter. So we've got one on planning for nature, which will explore how planning policy and legislation can be used to safeguard wildlife and shape sustainable development. We've got one all about creating a space for butterflies, with a huge focus on like the main caterpillar food plants. So how to encourage butterflies to your garden. And then finally, we've got Careers in Conservation Part 2, where you can discover what it's really like to spend a day working in conservation. And that's it. Thank you so much. I hope you found Josh's talk as amazing as I did. Huge thanks to Josh for giving up his time this evening to share his passion and incredible knowledge about wildflowers. And like I said, in the next few days, I'll upload the recording of this onto our Cheshire Wildlife Trust YouTube channel in case you want to have a look back through anything. And yeah, just I think I counted about 118 people on this call tonight. And I absolutely love the idea that if all of those 118 people went away and planted even just a small patch of wildflowers, think of the collective difference it would make. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you at another webinar soon. Bye.